Okay, good evening. My name is Susan Derwin, and I am the director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center and a professor of comparative literature and German. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's talk by Dexter Filkins, which is part of the IHC's 2017-18 Public Events Series, Crossings and Boundaries. We're grateful to the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life for co-sponsoring this event, so thank you very much. Dexter Filkins was last here in 2013 when he retraced the 7 years he spent covering the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's really great to have him back at UC Santa Barbara this evening, so thank you for coming. He has been a staff writer on The New Yorker since 2011, where he has focused on the war-torn countries of Iraq and Afghanistan and the volatile situations in Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey. From 2000 to 2010, he was at the New York Times, reporting from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. And before joining the Times, he worked at the Miami Herald and the Los Angeles Times, where he was the paper's New Delhi bureau chief. In 2009, he won the Pulitzer Prize as part of a team of Times journalists covering Pakistan and Afghanistan. He's received numerous other prizes, including 2 George Polk Awards and 3 Overseas Press Club Awards. His book, The Forever War, Dispatches from the War on Terror, won the 2008 National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction and was named a Best Book of the Year by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, and the Boston Globe. The depth and intimacy of knowledge Filkins brings to his reporting, both because of the time he spends in the regions from which he reports and because of the many viewpoints and voices he integrates into his work, make his perspective on contemporary conflict and crises extraordinary and invaluable. Tonight, Dexter Filkins will discuss the displacement and movement of more than 65 million people throughout the world. And while the sheer number of refugees is staggering, so too is the length of time they spend in limbo. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, 78% of the world's refugees are in a protracted refugee situation, which on average they endure for 26 years. In this state, their basic rights and essential economic, social, and psychological needs remain unfulfilled. So please join me now in welcoming Dexter Filkins to speak on the causes, conditions, and possible ways of addressing this urgent situation in his talk entitled Exodus, the Largest Movement of People Since the Second World War. Thank you.
I think I have to turn on my microphone. Can everybody hear me? God, I can't live up to an introduction like that. I'm blushing. Guys, thank you for coming. And I think there's a lot of students here, and I hope you're getting like a lot of extra credit. You'll deserve it. You know, I've been shot at like 1,000 times, and it's so much worse to stand in front of a merciless crowd and speak. We're going to talk about refugees tonight, and I wish it were kind of, I could say I'm going to be entertaining and funny, but it's a serious topic, and it's the world we live in. My friend Ian used to say that the first time you set foot in the third world, you realize you've won the lottery of life. And it's true. And, you know, we live in wealth and splendor compared to most of the world. And most people aren't so lucky, and they're moving. They're trying to better their circumstances, and I've got some really great photos that I'm going to show you, and we're gonna look at this map a little bit, and I think I'm going to try to kind of talk about the whole kind of universe of the refugee problem. First, I just want to tell a story about and I think it encapsulates the kind of refugee experience. A guy that I got to know, his name was Fareed Yousafzai, and I met him. I met him. This is Afghanistan. First time I went to Afghanistan in this is from 1998. This is downtown Kabul, actually, about a year before 9/11. The place was in total ruins. And I was working for the Los Angeles Times, and I was the Delhi correspondent, and the Taliban was the government they were running Afghanistan such as it was. But at that point, it was in total ruins. It was destroyed. There were 5 million refugees who were living outside of Afghanistan. And every now and then, the Taliban they would kind of announce that they were letting foreign journalists in, and kind of we'd all rush up there. And I had been there a couple times. I'd seen a public execution and an amputation. And I went there again. This is about a year before 9/11. And whenever you went to Afghanistan, under the Taliban, they would assign you a kind of a minder. And they'd say, here's your translator. But he was really a minder. And so you would go, when you went around and you talked to ordinary Afghans, they would all say, we love the Taliban. They're like amazing. And it was like really frustrating. And I was assigned this guy. He was like wearing a turban and he had a beard. And, he looked as sort of vacant-eyed as the rest of them. And his name was Farid. And I spent like a day with Farid, and I like wanted to blow my brains out. I was like totally bored and frustrated. And we went back to my hotel together, and we closed the door. And Farid took off his turban, and he said, like in perfect English, I absolutely hate the Taliban. I'm not even religious, and I know exactly what you want, and I can help you. And it was like an amazing moment, right? And he said, all I want is I want $150 a day in cash at the end of every day, because my whole family depends on me, and I'm probably going to get arrested. So I want to be paid at the end of every day so that I can give them the money. And I have 2 sisters, and everybody depends on me. And so we agreed, and then we had this amazing trip. We like went all over the country. We went to this village where there had been an uprising against the Taliban. We did this extraordinary stuff. And I remember we were sitting there in a smuggler's camp, like outside of Kandahar or something, and we were looking up at the stars, and it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, and Farid was carrying around this enormous novel, this English language novel called Rich Man, Poor Man. And it's this kind of, I think there was a mini-series on it a long time ago, and, lots of sort of sex and romance. And he was saying, if I went to America and I asked a woman to dance with me, would she say yes? And I said, Farid, that's the thing, you got to ask. And he thought for a long time, and he said, God, I really want to go to America, And I mean, but every person you meet in that part of the world says that. So anyway, Farid and I went back to Kabul. We went in to see a secret underground school for girls. The education of girls was not allowed. And as we were coming out, we were descended on by these the Afghan religious police. They're called the Vice and Virtue Police. They drive around in big pickup trucks, big turbans, big guns. And they beat the hell out of both of us. They took me away. They took me to the border and expelled me. And Farid disappeared. And so I this was like, at this point, it was the summer of, I guess that was the summer of 2000. I didn't hear from Farid for months. I was in Florida visiting my mom, and I got a phone call in the middle of the night, just 6 months later, a year later, and it was Farid. And he said, I've escaped from prison, and you got to help me. And I made it to the Pakistani border, and he waited. The Taliban took them out to pray on Ramadan, and he said, I waited for all their foreheads to hit the ground, and then I took off running. And he said, I made it to the border. You got to help me. I got to get out. They're going to find me, and they're going to kill me. And he was right. And so I called everybody I knew. I called the ambassador. I called everybody. And they got him out. This is before 9/11. The door to America was wide open. And we got him out. And at this point, it took a long time. This was like August 2001. I got a phone call from Farid. And he said, I'm in Jacksonville, Florida. And I'm working at a hospital. And he said, I went up on Highway 10 the other day looking for a disco, and I couldn't find one. But he said, I'm working in the hospital, and I'm working in the lens grinding department, and I met this woman, and she's from West Virginia, and she has long blonde hair down to her waist. This is like every Afghan's dream. And he was like, it's probably the first woman he met when he got off the plane. And so I said, God, Farid, that's incredible. It's amazing. Let's stay in touch. Like 2 weeks later, the planes hit the towers, and I was working for the New York Times. They said, get on a plane and find your way to Afghanistan. And so I thought I'd call Fareed one more time, and I called the hospital, and they said, no, he's left with his girlfriend, and they left a forwarding phone number. So I called this phone number, and this woman, it was a West Virginia number. This woman with this incredibly heavy accent answers the phone, hello? And I said, I'm looking for Fareed Yousafzai. She said, oh my God, and I said, my name's Dexter Filkins, I work for the New York Times. Oh my God, my daughter, she's engaged to a terrorist, to an Afghan. And I had to tell her, I said, no, Fareed's a great guy. He's an MD, he was a doctor in Afghanistan, he's a great guy. Don't worry. He said, oh my God, thank you so much. He's not here right now, he didn't have a cell phone. I took off, it was 2001. I didn't come back to America for basically 7 years. I was gone. I went to Afghanistan for a couple years, and I went to Iraq for 4 years. I came back. I looked for Fareed. I was thinking about him years later, all the wars and everything. Couldn't find him. I called every Afghan-American, association in America. 2008, I guess, so this is 7 years later, out of the blue, I got a phone call from Fareed. It's been 7 years. And my God, Fareed, what happened to you? Like, how's it going? And he said, it's great. I got married to the girl from West Virginia. We have a daughter, and I went to Emory Medical School, and I'm now a resident at Emory Medical School. And, it just knocked me out. And that to me is like, that's the story whenever I see one of the refugees, I think of Fareed, he was this guy that was just like filled with energy and filled with life, and all he needed was a chance, and he's doing great. We're just going to start going through some of these stories, some of these photos. So, but look, let's talk about the big picture because it's incredible. This is. Right now, before us, it's the largest movement of people in history. And before that, it was World War II. At the end of the Second World War, you had, people fleeing Stalin, Germans getting expelled, ethnic cleansing, borders were being redrawn. It was 40 million people. Now it's 65 million people out of their homes. You have essentially, if you break that down, it's about 25 million refugees. That's 25 million people who have left their country. 40 million people who are displaced internally, which means they're still living in their country, but they're out of their house. And that works out to it's astounding. The numbers are just incredible. And I usually don't like to deal with, I'm like an English major, but the numbers here are important. That's like 28,000 people a day are basically having to leave their homes. And the worst place in the world, I think, it's like a black hole, is Syria. The pre-war population of Syria was 22 million people. About half the country has been displaced. 5 million Syrians have left the country, and I think about 6 million have left their homes but are still inside. There's nothing like it, the time that we live in today. Most of the refugee camps that you go into, they're pretty typical in the sense that they're desperate. The last one I went into was outside of Mosul in northern Iraq. It was kind of as the offensive to push ISIS out of northern Iraq was happening. And so I went to this camp, and it was, again, this is typical. Camp was designed for 10,000 people. There were 30,000 people. They were getting out of their trucks. They were walking in. There would be a rumor that some truck was coming with mattresses, and so 500 women would line up for 12 hours waiting for them. There's open sewers. There's children playing in open sewers, and that's the life of the refugee. And in my job, I see them everywhere, and I mean, if you take, for instance, take Iraq and take Syria, the two places where there's so many refugees. During the Iraq War, there were 2 million Iraqis living in Syria, and now it's reversed. You know, now the Syrians are living in Iraq. And so and if you, some of these refugee camps are so giant. If you take I think it's called the Badibi camp in Uganda, 285,000 people. The Dabad camp in Kenya has 240,000 people. I remember once I was driving around in northern Pakistan. I was near the Indian border, the border with Kashmir, which is a disputed area. And there was like a camp, you know, just like I had no idea. And I just said to the driver, like, what's that? And he said, that's a camp. It's all women. It's about 1,000 women. And they're Indian women who've been raped by Indian soldiers who are now living here exclusively. So imagine that, a refugee camp filled with women who've been raped. You know, you've probably all seen the footage, and I have to remind myself to move the photos here. You've all seen the footage of the boats coming across the Mediterranean, and that's been, I mean, you know, I don't have to tell you about it. It's amazing, and I've got some pretty amazing photos here. Could we dim the lights maybe a little bit more? Since 2014, 1.5 million people have crossed the Mediterranean. And I wonder, could you go ahead and hit, maybe Aaron, if you could just hit the map. You don't have to spend too much time on this map, but it's a pretty interesting map because it'll sort of, it basically just shows you the flow of people. And so what's happening, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but what's happening in, you know, with the people who are coming across the Mediterranean they're coming up from Africa and across from Asia. So you have, again, I mean, just in 2015 alone, you had 335,000 people crossing the Mediterranean. It's gotten a little bit better. In 2016, I think it was down to like 150,000 or so. You know, before we kind of go on, I'm not really a big jargon person, but it's important to kind of understand. There's a couple of key terms that's important to know because not all refugees sort of fall into the same class, and they have different rights, and they want different things. So a refugee, kind of properly defined, is a person who has left his country and is kind of, you know, outside of his country, like living in a camp or wherever. An internally displaced person is a person who's still inside the country, but has been forced to leave his home. So like I said, in Syria, there's 6 million internally displaced people. They're basically homeless. What happened to my, one second. Sorry. Oh, then you have the third category, which is asylum seekers. And asylum seekers, and you kind of hear these words like thrown around all the time. An asylum seeker is somebody who's made it to the country that he wants to be in. And he says, essentially, I want to stay. And so, you know, all the migrants that you saw going, you know, walking across into Europe, they're trying to put their foot in Europe. I mean, that's what they're trying. The moment they cross the border, then they say, I want asylum. And under international law, which is basically everybody signed up for that, if you have a well-founded fear that you're going to be persecuted when you go home, then you have a series of rights before they can essentially deport you. So, but the largest category is none of those. And that's, you know, 65 million people. The largest category is just basically there's no legal term for them. They're migrants. They're just people who are looking for a better life. You know, they're people coming out of Africa and coming out of Asia, and there are 220 million people on the move right now who have left their homes, who are trying to, and they have like no proper legal status. They don't really have much in the way of rights. Depending on what country they're in, they're going to get deported, you know. So, I mean, those are your sort of four main categories. I want to talk about who's taking all these people, right? Who's taking all these refugees? And it's a little counterintuitive, right? So it's mostly poor countries that are taking all these desperate people. It's certainly not the Western countries, which we're gonna get to. So who has the most refugees right now? Turkey, which is, you know, a relatively rich country. It's a member of NATO. It's on the edge of Europe. They have 2.8 million refugees right now living in camps along the border. They're mostly from Syria. Pakistan, one of the world's poorest countries, 1.4 million people. Uganda, which is like tiny, they have 1 million refugees. The most interesting place, I've been there several times, is Lebanon. Lebanon is, it's an amazing country, but it's 4 million people. They have 1 million refugees. So basically 1 out of every 5 people that lives in the country is a refugee. And what's interesting about that place, and a lot of places like this, is there are no camps in Lebanon. Refugees just live in the cities. And so that's a kind of, what do you do with a refugee like that? They don't really need camps. So what does the UN do? The UN just gives them money. They basically give them money and say, you find an apartment, try to find a job, try to get your kid in school. But it's a very different experience. And then of course, I'm just kind of like going through the numbers here, but Germany is the kind of really big exception in the West. They've taken about 1.5 million migrants. Angela Merkel, you probably remember, she said, we can do this. That's a very complicated question, which we'll get to in a sec. Historically, the United States was always we were kind of the best at this. I think typically since 1980, we've let in 85,000 people a year, 85,000 refugees or asylum seekers. And, that's several million people. And now we're just this is not news to you, but, that number has just kind of dropped to virtually nothing. I think like in the past year or so, it's been about 14,000 people. So it's like gone from, we used to be the best, and now we're just, I know you know all this already. I think the most interesting thing here is let's I keep forgetting about these photos. The most interesting thing here is why is this happening, and why is it happening now? Like, why do we have 65 million people who are out of their homes? And I think there's 3 main reasons for that. And the first one is civil war, the second one is famine, and the third one is climate change. So let's talk about civil war for a second. If you think back to World War II, what was that? It was like wars between states. We don't really have that anymore. We have civil wars, and so, and the reason why that matters is because civil wars tend to go on forever. They go on for years, and so let me just give you a couple of examples. Afghanistan has been at war since 1979. The civil war in Somalia has been going on since 1991. The civil war in the Congo has been going on since 1991. It's years. Sri Lanka, where I've spent a lot of time, the civil war went on from 1983 to 2010, 27 years. And so what that means if you're a refugee is you don't get to go home. You're sitting somewhere else. And so look at, there's 3 countries in the world that make up for half the world's refugees, right? That's Syria, Afghanistan, and the South Sudan. Half the world's refugees. All 3 of those are at war. And so kind of war, it's obvious, right? But like war drives the movement of people. They're trying to get away. It makes sense. But what it means if you're a refugee is, and Susan touched on this, but the average stay of a refugee in a camp is 10 years. If you stay in a camp for more than 5 years, typically you're there for, your average stay is more than 20 years. So it's like a way of life for these people. Now, I'll give you an example. First time I went to Syria was 2003. The Iraq War was going on, and I was driving around Damascus. And Damascus, has a huge, and everybody was like, you got to go to the Palestinian refugee camp. So I wanted to go to the Palestinian refugee camp. Let's go to the camp. And it's called Yarmouk, and it's been there since 1957. There's 100,000 people in it. It's not even a camp. There are no tents. It's apartment buildings, there's stores, there's buildings, there's everything. It's been there at that point, had been there for nearly 50 years. Most of the people in the camp were born there. And so when you ask these people, are you going home? They're like, this is my home. So it's it's all this stuff, it's very counterintuitive. So that's like civil war. That's the big driver. The second one is just, again, these things aren't surprising, but the second one is kind of poverty generally and famine specifically. And I always think, I've spent the most time in Afghanistan, and a number sticks in my head. Afghanistan has just produced so many refugees. There's still 2.5 million refugees there. During the Russian invasion, it was like a quarter of the country was living outside of it. Afghanistan is, like, to me, it's the most beautiful place in the world. Just extraordinary. 6% of its land is arable. The rest of it is like desert and mountains. So like everything is scarce. So on a perfect day, the Afghans are fighting each other over resources because there just aren't any. And so, but what's happened, if you look at like right now, there are 4 countries that are either in famine or on the brink of famine, and essentially that means roughly 20 million people are kind of at the edge of starvation or at the brink of going hungry. That's Somalia, South Sudan, Nigeria, and Yemen. And I remember I had this conversation with an aid worker 20 years ago, and I've never forgotten it. And the aid worker said, when people are hungry, they move. And just remember that. When people are hungry, they move. And I've got to, we're not going to get to the photo for a while because I'm going too slow here, but you can, I remember once I was in Afghanistan. It was before the war had started. It was like 2 weeks before the bombing had started, and I was essentially sitting there waiting for the B-52s to come. And all the Afghans were coming out of a city. They were leaving. And I thought, well, they must be leaving the war, And so I stopped some guys on a road, and we're gonna see a picture of one of them in a second. But his name was Ali Mohammed Bakau, and I remember he was holding his child, and I said, "You must be fleeing the war." And he said, "No, it hasn't rained in my village in 3 years. We're just looking for food." He didn't even know that there was a war that was going to start. The thing about famine, and the important thing to remember about famine, and there's a famous Indian economist. His name is Amartya Sen, and he won the Nobel Prize for essentially saying one thing and proving one thing, which is there's no matter how bad the conditions of drought or locusts or whatever else, food will always get through unless man interferes. Famines are man-made, and that's the case. So for instance, the 4 countries that I just listed that are kind of at the brink of starvation, Yemen, Nigeria, South Sudan, and Somalia, they're all at war. Yemen is being blockaded by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. They're basically starving the country. Nigeria, the northern part of Nigeria, is basically in the grip of Boko Haram. All these countries, so like famine and war, they go together and they feed off of each other. So the third thing, and it's kind of the new thing, is climate change. And I gotta get on. I need somebody to like move these photos for me, because we've got some really interesting ones. The third thing is climate change. As I said, everything is kind of interconnected. War causes famine, which is also, famine is also driven by climate change, and all these things cause people to move. But climate change is kind of the new condition. So if you take the great apocalypse of our time, Syria, climate change, from 2008 to 2012, there was like the worst drought in 100 years in Syria. And it caused a huge movement of people, like mostly out of the northeast of the country into the cities. And they were primes. They were desperate. And so when the Arab Spring came, it was like a match on Tinder. The other really good example, and I want to get to some of these photos. This is a great photo. This is in Greece. As people, you remember people like when they were 2014 when they were walking. The other, and this is where I would sort of have you refer to the map here in North Africa. The Sahara Desert, because of climate change, the Sahara Desert has been advancing southward for a mile, roughly a mile a year, every year for the past 30 years. Like, it's coming, you know? And so it's squeezing the people who are still there. And it's driving the movement of people up. And the other, and we've got some photos from, the other ones, just sleeping. Hang on, I want to get to, that's a great photo. The other, hold on, what happened? I hope I didn't, the other really kind of premier example of climate change causing a flow of refugees is Darfur. And you've probably heard about Darfur, 3 million refugees in Darfur, probably 200,000 people dead. Started in 2003, it's still going on. It basically began over a series of water disputes and land disputes. I mean, it all really just tracks right back to climate change. I think we're just about there. Yeah, this is Darfur. You know, I remember this was like 1,000 years ago. I had never even thought about climate change, and I was in the Maldives, and I don't know how many of you have been to the Maldives, but it's in these little islands in the Indian Ocean, and they're incredibly beautiful, and like they're gorgeous, and people just come and like sit on the beach. They're like freaked out about climate change, and I remember talking to the Minister for Water Resources or whoever it was, and he said they'd already were building barriers around the island, and he said we are going to become the first environmental refugees. You know, environment. I'd never heard that phrase before, and that was like 20 years ago. You know, and for me, let me just say, we're still in Darfur here. To me, kind of the best example of where like all these three things that we're talking about come together, you know, civil war, poverty and famine, and climate change, is Libya. And like, I don't, you know, they tell you in public speaking, you should always leave the podium. So Libya's here. And you can see, so the reason why Libya is so interesting and so crucial in what's happening in the world of refugees is that in 2011, when the Arab Spring started, you remember, you know, Muammar Gaddafi was the dictator. He'd been there at that point for like 40 years. He was nuts. He was a terrible human being. And he was basically bearing down on his own people, and he was going to start killing them. And the United States and Europe intervened. We drove him from power. We basically knocked off his government, and then we didn't really have a plan to go further than that. And so since then, basically the Libyan state collapsed. I mean, if you ever hear anybody say Libyan government, you should just make sure you put quotations around it, quotation marks. There's kind of a Libyan government, but for the most part, the state in Libya has collapsed. And what does that mean? That means that all the refugees from Africa who are fleeing essentially war and climate change and famine, they're crossing the Sahara, they're moving into Libya, they get to the Mediterranean coast, you make contact with a smuggler, you pay him some money, you get on a boat, and you go to Europe. And that's basically what's happening. And Libya is sort of the place where kind of all that, for me, comes together. I want to say, you know, we've gone in. How am I doing on time? We've gone into. I got to get through these photos, though. Yeah, why don't you click through? I just keep forgetting. Let's just talk about the impacts here. And I've been talking about Europe a lot because Europe's the West. It's kind of, you know, it's very close to the United States. It's kind of at the front line of this stuff. And if you just think about the way in which the refugee crisis, the global refugee crisis, is transforming Europe. I mean, if you just take a country like Greece, right? I mean, Greece is like the size of LA County, right? It's like, you know, a little bit larger. It's like 13 million people. They have 62,000 refugees who are just living, you know, 6,000 on the island of Lesbos, which is like, smaller than Santa Barbara. It's in hundreds of thousands in Italy. Merkel, as I said, has let in 1 million people. These are not popular actions. It's not been popular for these leaders to take refugees in. And the best example of that is Merkel in Germany. She basically made this, what I would consider this, carried away, this courageous decision to take 1 million people in. She said, look, we can do it. Just, bring them in. And since then, her political position in the country it hasn't collapsed, but she's much weaker. She's in a much weaker place than she was now. There's now, I never thought I'd say there's it's not quite a fascist political party in Germany. It's called AfD, Alternative for Germany. It's far right. It's now one of the strongest parties in the country. It's caused this kind of great backlash, and that's happening all across Europe. You see kind of the rise of these intensely nationalistic populist parties in Italy, in the United Kingdom, in France, and you've seen particularly even in countries in Europe that haven't taken any refugees, like Hungary, which take virtually none. In Poland, they've taken almost no refugees. The leaders have these kind of very populist, kind of very right-wing, very nationalistic leaders have risen up, kind of like Trump, saying, I'm going to keep the immigrants out, and Christian civilization is being threatened, and, the brown tide is sort of coming. And it's like they've become very, very powerful in those countries, but it's largely been driven by this backlash against immigration. And so it's forced the West to make all these kind of strange, uncomfortable accommodations. So for instance, if you remember, are you flipping through those? If you remember the giant mass of people, the 1 million people that went to Germany in 2014, they essentially were walking across Turkey and into Europe. And as soon as they got to Europe, they could ask for asylum. That's not happening anymore. Why is that not happening? Because Europe made a deal with the elected president, but increasingly authoritarian leader of Turkey, Tayyip Erdogan, to stop the flow. I'll hold him here, right? But the price they're paying for that is Erdogan is basically strangling Turkish democracy, and you will not hear a peep out of Europe about that. He got a blank check from Europe. He pretty much got a blank check from the United States. Nobody criticizes him, and the reason why is because he's holding the refugees back, and so he's got Europe over a barrel. And so Europe, they're faced with this kind of impossible dilemma. And I think I mentioned this to you when we were coming over here. I was talking over the summer. Just a couple months ago, I was in Paris and I was talking to this very senior French diplomat who I had known from the Middle East, and we were talking about the Mediterranean and the refugees who were coming. And he said, this is a really long-term problem, and it's not going to get any smaller. And he gave me the example of the African country of Niger. And Niger is it's over just to the left of Libya in the Sahel, just below the Sahara. And it's a country of 20 million people, has virtually no resources. It's sending a lot of migrants north up into the Sahara and then into Europe. In 40 years, not so long from now, the population of Niger will be 100 million people. And that's going to be true essentially all across North Africa. The populations are growing. Climate change it's not getting any better. And so if you're Europe, you're faced with this really, really giant problem that you've got to get a hold of. And so I think they're still at the point where they're doing it's stuff at the margins. Like, for instance, I think Germany and France and Italy, they tried to set up asylum offices in parts of North Africa. And they said, instead of coming across the Mediterranean, you can apply here. And so what happened was, of course, all these huge population flows went to these little offices, and it didn't work. Look at what the Italians are doing right now. The Italians are paying the Libyan government, again, the Libyan government, they're paying the Libyan government to basically stop migrants at the shores. You know, they're paying the Libyan Coast Guard to basically hold migrants there. And that's if you're on the ground in Libya, it's like a nightmare. So you have tens of thousands of people streaming north through the Sahara, you know, totally desperate. They're getting to the shores of the Mediterranean. They're basically being stopped. And then it's like, where do you go? They go home. A lot of them get arrested. They get put in jail. It's a mess, you know? So the one country I haven't really mentioned here is the United States. So again, we always kind of led the world, you know, typically 85,000 people a year. I think we've let in like maybe 18,000 Syrians since the war began there in 2011, but a pretty paltry number. I'll give you an example of how hard it is to kind of, if you're a person in public life in America who cares about this stuff, it's hard. And so, for instance, Ryan Crocker, probably never heard of the guy. He's a former ambassador to a lot of really hard countries in the world. He's a great guy, and he really kind of like one of the sort of great American diplomats that you've never heard of. And Crocker's kind of retired, but you know, he was teaching in Texas, and he wrote an op-ed in 2015 for the Wall Street Journal in which he said, I think we should take 100,000 Syrian refugees in starting like right now. He was deluged with hate mail. You know, it was coming into his office. He got death threats. He's like left the university. If you pull up the article that he wrote for the Wall Street Journal, there's like 1,000 comments on him basically saying, you know, get the hell out of here and go home. You know, and that's kind of the climate. You know, I don't have to tell you, it's a strange time in the United States. Strange historically, it's unusual. I mean, if you look at, take the State Department, the current administration, they came in and they proposed cutting the budget of the State Department, all foreign assistance, all humanitarian assistance, which we don't spend a lot on anyway. I mean, foreign aid is like 1% of the federal budget. It's like nothing. Cutting it by a third. They've tried to cut the size of the whole US diplomatic corps by a third. They're trying to just pull back from the world. They were stopped in those budget cuts by Congress, by Republicans in Congress who still couldn't stomach them. But I just want to say a little bit more about America, and I promise you we're almost done, and I want to hear questions from you. If you look at, you know, the United States, you know, we're a big, powerful country, and we do a lot of stuff in the world, a lot of it good, some of it not. But if you look at, take the Vietnam War. We made the Vietnam War, you know, and it didn't turn out very well when we basically left Vietnam and we kind of failed to achieve what we wanted to achieve. After the Vietnam War, we made a political decision to allow in, I think, ultimately 850,000 Vietnamese, or Vietnamese, Cambodians, Laotians. And you can go back, I mean, you can like go to YouTube and you can see these guys like in the Carter administration like saying it's our moral duty to do this. And like we did it, you know? And if you look at the wars that we've made recently, Iraq and Afghanistan, we haven't done a lot there. You know, if you look at Iraq, where there's millions of internally displaced people, the state there is essentially destroyed. I think we've let in 80,000 Iraqis, you know, since 2003. Not so many, and I think even fewer Afghans. So I just want to say, I'm just about done here. How are we doing on the photos? Yeah, I think that's the last photo. I love this photo. You can see she's protecting her daughter. That's in northern Iraq, and they were coming out of Mosul. I just want to. No, skip that. That's just more. I don't want to get too preachy, but I do want to say, you know, there was a great. I'm stealing all of this from. There was a column in the New York Times recently by Bret Stephens, and who is, I think he grew up in Mexico, and his parents are immigrants. And he kind of went back and did some work, and he said, look, the people we ought to be deporting are the Americans who've been here for several generations. Immigrants start businesses at twice the rate of people who were born here. They have way more babies. They have fewer births out of wedlock. They commit fewer crimes. Their incarceration rate is half of what it is for native-born people. You know, I mean, I could go on. I could stand up here and babble on forever. Albert Einstein was a refugee. So was Enrico Fermi. So was Vladimir Nabokov. I could go on and on. You know, America has always belonged to the newcomer. And, you know, I hope that continues, but I think it's kind of in play right now, just like so many other things. So we can only hope for the best and kind of keep fighting. So I'm gonna like shut up for a second and drink some water, but I hope you have some questions, particularly you students. And if you have, do we have like a microphone or anything? If you have any questions, I'd be like happy to take some of them. Hey, you know what? I'm just a clicker. No, I don't have more slides. I just want to. Let's see. We can sort of back it up here. Yeah, that's another Kurdistan. You went through them all. Yeah. Do we have? Does it? Come on. Go ahead, please.
Could you talk a little bit about any differences you saw in, you know, the migrant experience as a female versus as a male?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
The gendered migrant experience, like, you know, how it's different from
Look,
females?
it's harder to be a woman. I don't have to tell you that, but in that part of the world, it's really, really hard to be a woman. And I haven't seen a lot of that personally. Because when you work in the Muslim world, I mean, if you're a man working in the Muslim world, and particularly a Western man, it is often impossible to talk to women. Not always. You can talk to old ladies and mothers and stuff, but it's very, very hard. And so you see these things kind of unfolding in front of you. Like you probably remember the Yazidis in northern Iraq who were, you know, basically enslaved. I mean, the women were basically kidnapped into sex slavery and prostitution by ISIS. It's like hell on earth, you know. So I think the short answer is it's immeasurably hard to be. Refugees are vulnerable, and you know, women doubly so, of course. You know, we got another brave one.
I'm not a student actually, but thanks for the talk. So I mean, what you've presented, it's kind of an apocalyptic vision of what's happening in the world today.
Yeah, I didn't mean for it to sound.
That's okay. It's okay. You're allowed to bum us out. But you know, Steven Pinker, who's a professor at Harvard, has published a new book which basically is the opposite argument. The world's getting better.
It is getting better.
Fewer people live in poverty.
I mean, it depends on who you are, but.
Right, but his arguments don't just apply to the West, right?
Yes.
His argument is we've made great progress in lifting people out of poverty and providing food, shelter, all those things. So I'm just curious how you know, I don't doubt for a minute, you've obviously been there, you've seen this. I'm just curious how you square those two views of the world.
I think, well, I think we got to be able to hold two totally opposing viewpoints in our head at the same time. I think the world is getting better. Of course it is. It's like poverty is way less than what it used to be in almost everywhere in the world. You know, you asked about women. I mean, the rights of women and the power that women have is like so much more than it used to be, even in places in the Muslim world. But you have this kind of breakdown which is happening at the same time. And so it's a kind of so if the curve, and maybe I should have said at the beginning, like the world's getting better and better, but and it's kind of like the world is kind of ascending. I mean, people are getting wealthier and they're not as sick, and babies don't die so often before their first birthday. But you have this kind of terrible way which is pulling that curve down, you know. But that's a good point. Thank you for making it. I promise I'll come to you over there. Ma'am.
I may be on the doom and gloom side. I recall reading about the refugee situation and Canada's attempts to provide host families to take on refugees, and how they learned about how when these refugees come into their country, they're unskilled, but their lack of education, they're so far behind in terms of where we are just for an unskilled Western worker, that for them coming in, it can be quite paralyzing and overwhelming. And so when you think about, when you multiply that by the millions of people who are being dislocated, I think that's also paralleling a population of people who are being uneducated or lacking educational resources. And this is also timing the trajectory of AI, artificial intelligence, the growth of displacing these uneducated folks who lack competitive skills. And so I'm just curious if this is being considered in any scope in the U.S., outside the U.S., where are these conversations happening?
That's a tough one. I mean, it's basically, it's like, can we find jobs for all these people, right? Kind of uneducated, people who can't speak the language. I hear you. You're absolutely right. It's also true that if you're leaving aside America for a second, if you're Europe, they're looking at you're talking about an apocalypse. They're not going to be able to pay for. I mean, the bulge in their population is later in life, and there's not going to be enough people to pay for their retirement accounts, and their pensions and their health care, and they need as many people as they can get. Their birth rates are basically zero, But that's a fair question. I think, for me, the question is, if you take a million migrants and you drop them into a country, a million migrants from, say, a very different civilization, which the Muslim one is, and I love the Muslim world. I've lived there for many, many years, but it's different. And when you drop a million of them into Germany all at once, there was that kind of notorious incident in Germany when a bunch of guys kind of went nuts and a lot of women were assaulted and raped. And if you lived in the Muslim world, that's not surprising, and that's not, I sound like I'm generalizing, and I don't mean to, but it's a problem that you have to kind of think about and address. These are not easy questions at all. And it's the easiest thing in the world would be to say, let's just let in 10 million people. You can't. I mean, it's got to be thought through.
Okay, thank you.
Sir.
Hey, thank you for a lecture.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk
I hope
more.
it wasn't a lecture.
No. It was a very nice story. Not nice in that sense, but I wonder if you could tell me more about, or you try to explain why the U.S., why immigration has become so unpalatable in the U.S., compare with the past examples that you gave with Vietnam War and even before that.
You mean what's happened here?
Yeah, kind of what's happened since that has made it so unpalatable.
I'm not an expert on America. God, who is anymore? But I think in America but in that one I think it's pretty clear. I mean, living standards for the middle class have not gone up in a long time. Things are getting better in many, many ways, but living standards have basically went flat, and so I think people feel inequality is massive compared to what it used to be. So, God, you should see New York. You see it all around you. You see inequality all around you, and I think that's driving a lot of it's just kind of making people very angry, And I don't think it's a lot more complicated than that.
Thank you for a really interesting talk. You touched upon Vietnam and World War II, and there's very different situations in terms of race, in terms of culture. Things have changed in those respects. But I'm just curious. I recently discovered my family's immigration documents in a shoebox in the attic. My family came to this country in 1951 as displaced persons. And I'm just curious if displaced persons are legally a different thing from refugees. Are there still displaced persons? Is that no longer a valid category? What's the story there? What's changed? Or?
DP, yeah. I think Audrey Hepburn was a DP, I think, as well. No, I think that's legally different. I think that's a refugee now. I think, but it was like World War II, and so everything was super mixed up because, there were these people were just being expelled, and they were fleeing, and they were redrawing the borders of countries, and so you just had tens of millions of people who were displaced in the relatively kind of small area of Europe, and it was you just had millions of people showing up in West Germany. You know, like what do we call these people? But I think classically now they're refugees. Sounds like a great shoebox though. Like that's a great find. Like you got a good story there.
It was incredible. Yeah, we had found tons of photos.
Where are they from?
My family's originally from Krakow. They survived Buchenwald, and
Oh my God.
and I found a shoebox full of photos from the DP camps, which we didn't know existed. So.
God. Amazing. Sir.
Hello. Oh, that was a little loud. Hello. Great talk. But so historically in America, there have been a lot of others that have been villainized as the bad immigrant, right? The ones who were in our country. So there were the Germans, and then there were the Irish, and I'm pretty sure the Italians were part of that. And then the Japanese, right?
Sure.
And now it is the Muslim world.
Sure.
So do you see a future where Muslims are assimilated into American society, and maybe we move to another other, or or do you think that
It won't be anybody left.
this is more permanent than?
I don't know. But you're right. I mean, everybody got it. I mean, just about. But I don't know. You know, if you go to L.A., I mean, right? They're everywhere. I mean, if you go to New York City, I mean, in Queens. I mean, I live in New York. There's 115 languages spoken in Queens. You know, it works. Like the city works. It's like amazing. Nobody's gonna. I don't know. I think nobody's gonna care what their last name is like a generation from now. I hope so. Maybe I'm wrong. You know, I'm hopeful.
All right, thank you.
Are we going to end on a hopeful note? Do we have one more person? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
So I was wondering, sort of in an environmental context, with climate change and land loss and everything associated with that,
Yes.
and the ongoing issue of population growth, what do you think the dynamic there is? And like, what can we sort of expect with that situation?
God, I mean, when you talk about like bleak, when you look at when you take a country like Bangladesh, which is like basically at or below sea level, like I don't know, 80% of it is population, 80 million people. And when you I don't know how many of you have been to Bangladesh. It's an incredibly beautiful country, but you're basically driving on dikes, and then like the country's like beneath you, and it's like, you know, rice paddies and you know, every 10 years there's like a giant tidal wave and half the country gets washed away. And you can see like climate change is just, it's coming, you know, and you know, the world's population is centered on the coast. That's where all the people are. So I mean, we got a lot of challenges ahead. I mean, look, man's a pretty resilient animal, you know. I think we'll probably figure out a way out of all this stuff, but it's gonna take a lot of work, you know. And a country like Bangladesh doesn't have a lot of money, so I think it's gonna be easier for us than it is for them, you know.
Thank you.
Sir. Oh, I'll come back.
That's okay.
Okay, so you've exposed us to this kind of crisis that's going on, and to follow up on what she was saying, like there is no, the future is not going to get better.
No,
Well, I mean, but it's like we're talking about like famine. We could see the increase of famine and refugee crisis.
No, it's just
in the future.
hard.
And I mean,
future's always hard, man. Yeah.
Taking in refugees is a good way to stop help the ongoing problem. But I mean, in your years of experience, what like practices have you seen that have been effective in dealing with refugee crisis? You know, enabling these people to get an education and basically, like you're talking about in the Palestinian refugee camp, they're able to build on their refugee camp and actually exist where they're trying to.
Well, look, that's a huge question, but I think like, if you take, for instance, France and Germany and Italy now, I think they're thinking in terms of, and they're doing this now. They're going like into North Africa to work on North Africa and develop North Africa and like strengthen the governments there and the societies and build schools and stuff, because they realize that like that's the only long-term answer for them, is to have kind of Africa thrive in a way that so that it's not sending huge streams of people coming over. And I think that's like probably the only way, is to like engage, you know.
And then the second part is like you have a body of students here, but like what's your call to action for us? Like what could you tell us to?
God. I'm not an advocate. I mean, I'm just a reporter. But Be nice. Let me think about that one.
Okay. Thank you.
Call to action. I could say something about the 2018 elections, but I won't do that. Sorry, you. Sorry.
Yes, hi. I just want to say thank you for opening this discussion. Actually, myself, I personally volunteered on Lesbos with an NGO for about 2.5 months last summer.
On Lesbos?
Yeah, in 3 different refugee camps.
Wow.
I spoke to, you meet people from everywhere, from Congo, Syria, Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And when you start speaking to people, I think there's definitely a conflict between people's national pride of wanting to go back eventually, because I think a lot of Syrians actually talk about going back to their country, and they, a lot of people are like, I'm working to save up to build my home again in Syria. And I think that discussion is definitely put down a little bit, because a lot of people just see them as going into Europe, taking jobs,
Sure.
and especially in Greece, it's a very, very contested point.
Yeah, that's the condition of exile.
Yeah, and people are actually still coming from Turkey. A lot of the work I did was actually boat watch and being able to bring people onto the shore, and they're coming straight from work exploitation in Turkey and other places. So I think after continuing to talk to a lot of people, a question I wanted to pose to you, that's kind of related to what he was saying, is that a lot of people are really interested in going home, especially also people from Afghanistan don't think that there's a lot there for them. But as you were talking about aid projects happening in those places, has anything started in terms of foreign aid coming in? And in a sense, how much work do you think NGOs will help in those countries in starting up education?
You can't really generalize about that, but it's. I mean, look, I think that if you're a refugee or an immigrant, it's like the condition of exile. I mean, you never feel at home where you live, and you always miss the home where you don't want to go back to. I mean, it's like that you live in two worlds, But most of most of the immigrants, the people who arrive in the United States, they send money back. I mean, that whether it's Mexico or or Africa or India or wherever, and I think that's always been true. So there's always at least for a generation or two, there's a connection, and a lot of immigrants do go back.
And sorry, I'll be quick because I know there's other questions.
Yeah.
From Afghanistan, when you spoke to people, did a lot of people, since that's a lot of where you did your work, do people talk about ever thinking about coming home eventually to their country, even though they're moving for climate reasons, other reasons? Do you think you can classify refugees in different ways?
No. I mean, that's a good question, but no, I think they don't know. I mean, they just want to, look, they want a better life. They're going to go find it, and they're going to keep moving until they do. And I think, but every Afghan I know that lives in the United States misses his country, and he doesn't really feel at home here.
Yeah.
Either. But he doesn't miss enough to go back.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's kind of,
varies.
it's like again, it's kind of the condition of the refugee, the permanent condition.
Thank you so much.
We'll take a couple more. Go fast.
Okay. All right. Nice.
We'll get to you.
Oh, okay. Well, first off, again, thanks for the presentation. I'm already echoing what everybody's saying, but really, I can't thank you enough.
Right, thank
you.
you.
Really cool.
You're right.
So I had a question about relations between refugees in a given host country. Now, this sounds kind of confusing, but bear with me. I'll try to make a long story short. So I come from Cambodian refugee background, and essentially what happened once when my grandfather and his children came here was that everybody got sick, and he couldn't pay for everything because he didn't get his welfare check yet, and he tried to act through the welfare office, through the help of a Cambodian already employed there, but that Cambodian kept lying to him about other ways he could get his welfare check. So is there a sense of kicking down that you've noticed? We're already higher up on the ladder. We're kicking down the steps below us.
Well, I think the phrase that I've heard is every generation of immigrants pulls up the ladder as they come ashore, if they come aboard. Yeah.
All right.
It's pretty typical,
All right. Nice. Thanks.
Should I maybe take a couple more and then we can answer them afterwards, or maybe we should do that. So go ahead.
Okay. Thank you again for your talk.
Thank you.
So it might be a little long, so bear with me. How do we deal with privilege, especially in the U.S., while we see all of this unfolding from a distance? When do we stop romanticizing these humans and actually realize we're in some ways part of the problem by understanding these refugees are humans and not just some subject of a photograph art project?
I don't know. That's a good question. How do we like get beyond the abstractions? I mean, that's what we're trying to do right now, right? We're trying to talk about them as real people. But I mean, it's hard. I mean, I think, you know, you can give money to like save the children. You can do a lot of stuff like that, but it's difficult because you're only one person. That's it. You know, you can have the right attitude about it, but that's not going to change the condition for them. You know, I think that's the hard truth.
A lot of these photos remind me of Dorothy Lang and kind of the romanticizing of those people migrating to different parts of the U.S. and looking like just an art project as opposed to actual humans going through crises.
Well, I would disagree with you. I think she's trying to bring, that woman looks like a human being to me. And I can sort of, I can imagine that I can feel what she's going through. And like, if you can come up with a better idea, you should do it. But I mean, otherwise, it's kind of the best we got, you know? I mean, everybody came here tonight because that's what they care about.
Okay, thank you.
One more? Okay, how about one more? Sir, yeah. I promise.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Thank you for your talk. And so I'm gonna reference a book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger, and the quote is, "Disasters he proposed to create a community of sufferers that allows individuals to experience an immensely reassuring connecting to others." Could you hear me?
What? Sorry, what's the question?
Oh, sorry. So I'm just going to quote him. "Disasters he proposed create a community of sufferers that allows individuals to experience an immensely reassuring connection to others." So he's referencing, he's talking about the collapse of institutions after war.
The collapse of?
Of institutions.
Yeah.
And given that you've been...
Well, let me just, I think I can answer your question. Sebastian, he quoted Sebastian Junger. He's a friend of mine from like all the terrible places. And he's like a very complicated guy. But Sebastian, I think, kind of nailed it in that quote and in a large book for me, kind of nailed it because I feel the same way, which is when you go over there, you think it's like really bad, but like you really don't feel, you don't feel weird until you come home. And it's when you come home and you see, you kind of expect, you talk about romanticization. You romanticize your home, you romanticize the country, and you come back and nobody cares. And Sebastian's written very, very eloquently on that. And I think that's kind of, and that's what the veterans feel in particular because they're part of these very tightly knit units and kind of people are risking their lives for one another. And then they come home and it's like, it's America and it's kind of everybody out for for themselves. And that's the most dislocating part of coming back to the United States.
Yeah, that basically answered my answer. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's it. Can I talk to you afterwards? You want to go now? Super quick. Afterwards? Okay.
More questions after. Thank you.
Thank you.